Entering into this console generation among Xbox and PlayStation, I don't really know where my expectations were. With Xbox, they had a number of studios, a number of games announced, and many of them still haven't released. And the ones that have come about, like the behemoth that Starfield was supposed to be, ended up under-delivering. And it's a mess. Matt Booty, Phil Spencer, they have a lot of work on their hands, and it just doesn't seem like things are getting better. But they do have a number of games in development, and we'll see if they end up being great. I mean, I underestimated Indiana Jones. That ended up being pretty good, although nobody showed up for it. I think that's the big problem. There was supposed to be an explosion in Game Pass, and that has not happened, and hardware sales are actually they're getting worse. Now, with PlayStation, though, again, because this is a console war, and although these console wars are over, that's the big thing. You'll see it on social media. People play these games of Xbox versus PlayStation, but it's over. Phil Spencer admitted it. They lost the console generation that mattered, and that's because PlayStation dominated the PlayStation 4 generation from the get-go. From the decision to mock Xbox about, being able to play games or trade games with your friends with discs and stuff. That was, the mockery started there, and then PlayStation just constantly delivered. It was hit after hit release. And single player that's what they were known for. That is what made that console generation. But right towards the end of the PlayStation 4 console generation, there was a power struggle between Sean Layden and Jim Ryan, and it's quite clear that Jim Ryan won it, and his big vision was live service. And that is the investment that we've seen this console generation. The news of the last couple of weeks and the last couple of months has just been nightmarish in regards to this. Obviously, PlayStation has had some success this console generation. Demon's Souls Remake, Returnal, Astrobot, those are some of the notable releases that were great. God of War Ragnarok, say what you will about it, still managed to make a lot of money in sales. And Last of Us Part 2, that's still been successful with all the remasters and everything. So look, PlayStation is continuing to have success, but in my opinion, I just think that this console generation has been a disaster in terms of at least what I was expecting out of them. The momentum that they had going from the PlayStation 4, it fell apart because of bad investments and bad decisions coming from Herman Hulst and Jim Ryan. And it really is that chase for live service, recurrent consumer spending. And that is one of the big things that many AAA publishers are running into. It's a wall, because the reality is you're only going to have a couple of massive live services that end up taking off. Most of them end up in disaster and ruin, and that's just what's been dominating the news the last decade or so. We just keep on having news story after news story, and PlayStation is right there. Not just with Concord, but a lot of the investments and a lot of the studios. It seems like every studio has been working on a live service, and most of them will never see the light of day. Now look, the success that PlayStation has had this console generation has continued. I mean, them versus Xbox, they're beating them 5-1 in sales just from November. There's no argument that they are succeeding, but just because they're succeeding financially doesn't mean that they've created a generation that's going to be memorable. And that's why we're already hearing discussion about the PlayStation 6, and I find that so disappointing, because we're going to look back in the PlayStation 5, and unless things really change over the course of the next year or two, I just think it's a ginormous disappointment and arguably a disaster with the investments that did not pay off. Now, Xbox, obviously, on the other hand, I mean, look, they're talking about porting over Halo to PlayStation. They're a third-party publisher that was leaked about a year or two ago. They kind of went into damage control, but this is the reality. They lost the console generation that mattered, and they haven't had the success that they hoped for with games like Starfield. They thought that was going to bring in many more subscriptions, many more hardware sales, and that just didn't happen. It's the reason why Black Ops and all these, they're making sure that they're third party. They're making sure that they're releasing on PlayStation, where majority of console players are at right now, and soon Nintendo. Now, the big thing about PlayStation, they've been changing for a while now. Even before the end of the PlayStation 4 console generation, the big move that has been constantly talked about, and I talked about it years ago on this channel, was their move to America. And PlayStation immediately in 2016, when this was announced, they said that it wasn't going to change their DNA from Tokyo to California. Although even at the time, it did seem like they were pushing away from their cultural identity with the Japanese, their audience, their company, their everything. And their move to California definitely feels like it has taken on more of a role than they like to admit. And what do I mean by that is around 2018, when we started really having these discussions with censorship policies that they were enacting on Japanese developers, which honestly at the time were ridiculous. If you missed that video from years ago, check it out, but it still is extremely relevant with some of these games and some of their policies which have aged poorly. And fortunately, they have reversed course on a number of these things. Like, this is a big instance we talked about. Devil May Cry 5 has a censored scene in the West, but only on PlayStation 4. And it was specifically this scene, and it got us a lot talking about the identity of PlayStation. And then, let's be honest, they have moved further and further away from their Japanese identity. We've seen that with them shutting down their Japan studio. This is something that a number of developers have called out PlayStation for, saying that it didn't make any sense and it was a stupid move. And nowadays, you look at a game like Astro Bot and the success that they have, you think that a studio like Japan Studio could have continued that success if they were given the funding. But truthfully, Jim Ryan, Herman Hulse, they didn't want to make those investments. The investments that they wanted to make in was live services. And that's why we moved to just the end of 2023, The Last of Us Online. It was worked on for like 3 to 4 years. It ended up being canceled. And that was after reports, months of reports of constant chaos and them not being able to put things together. They brought in like a Fortnite monetization. It was all over the place. There was the concerns that this was going to be a messy live service. And I think Naughty Dog PlayStation saw the writing on the wall and they realized it wasn't worth it, and they pivoted back to obviously working on now that the game that was announced just recently, Intergalactic, The Prophet, or something along those lines, and probably soon The Last of Us Part 3. A smart decision, but one that should have been made years beforehand. And then there was obviously Deviation Games. This was a studio set up by Call of Duty Zombies mode creator Jason Blundell and Treyarch veteran Dave Anthony. They didn't even release a game. It was supposed to be a live service thing. They didn't ship their game before the studio was shut down. And then last year, around February, Sony laid off 900 PlayStation employees and they shut down their London studio, which was working on a co-op multiplayer game of sorts that, again, we don't know how far into development that was, but I assume it was probably going to be another live service. Then there was news that Insomniac Games had been working on, at least maybe it was in the concept stages, it's not clear how far it went, but Spider-Man The Great Web was supposed to be a multiplayer, probably a live service, and again, that died. And then in March 2024, we got an announcement that Twisted Metal was supposed to be getting a live service game, and then part of the mass layoffs that happened in February, this was another project that had been canceled. Then there was Foam Stars. This was a third-party game, but still something that PlayStation, I think, assumed was going to take off because of its Splatoon-like identity. It didn't. It lost nearly 95% of its player base within the first month or two, and I think it's since been pretty much shut down or ignored or forgotten. The one success that they did have in terms of live services was Helldivers 2, and it can't be forgotten that PlayStation immediately shot themselves in the foot by requiring a PlayStation account. Obviously, they reversed course later on, but not before there was massive damage to the Helldiver brand in PlayStation. And this is a policy that only continued into the future, in which many PlayStation single-player experiences required it, and that meant 177 countries and territories that PSN is not available in, they couldn't even have the choice to buy the game on Steam. Just a stupid, ridiculous decision in my opinion. Then there was Bungie. This is another massive investment that PlayStation made. It was more of a reaction to what Xbox had done with Activision Blizzard. At the time, it seemed like a bold move, but Bungie has been just constantly hit with chaos, constant under-delivering with their product with Destiny, and they've been hit with mass layoffs and really questions about the future of this company and whether, PlayStation will end up having to swallow them on up. We did see just a couple of weeks ago that Destiny 2 has lost 90% of its Steam players in 7 months despite tons of content, and some of that was highly regarded in terms of critic reception, but it didn't matter because I think there's just an exhaustion and many people don't want to play Destiny 2 anymore, and it doesn't seem like Destiny 3 at all is anywhere near even being discussed in conversations. All eyes for Bungie is on Marathon, which, again, this is another project that has been in chaos, in which, some of the news and information coming out about the project is that the game has not been in a great state. It also lost its a game director a couple of months ago after they were embroiled in a misconduct scandal. So Bungie, the future of that company, just appears to be an absolute mess right now. There was also Concord. This is the most infamous of them all. This was the big investment. They spent somewhere around $200 million acquiring Firewalk Studios before they had even released a game. And Concord, $40 live service hero shooter, no distinct identity, unappealing characters, really, again, just no identity. It looked like Overwatch clone, and ultimately it released to 697 players on Steam, and it died within 2 weeks. $40 hero shooter that nobody wanted, and I just genuinely have no idea how it made it even to release without PlayStation knowing that this was going to be a massive flop. That debut trailer showed all of us that this was headed for catastrophe, and that's very much what happened. Although I think nobody expected the historic flop that it ended up being. But yeah, Firewalk Studios closed almost 2 weeks afterwards, and yeah, Sony realized the writing was on the wall. Going free to play was not an option. And then we obviously got the reports afterwards that Sony had reportedly invested $400 million into Concord, just a ridiculous sum. But based on some of the reporting of other games like Call of Duty spending like $700 million on their yearly releases, this is just the new norm. These budgets have gotten way out of hand in this industry, and PlayStation is very much one of those publishers that is contributing to these problems. And, you know, the wait between releases, 7-8 years, it's just a whole, this is a discussion maybe for another day, but we're seeing that with so many different entries, and seeing these studios, single-player studios, spending so much time, especially with PlayStation, with Naughty Dog investing so many resources and time, and not even releasing these live services, it really just says a lot about the mismanagement happening in this AAA games industry. But obviously there was some other non-live service things that PlayStation did release last year. They've been really going hard on Lego, or the Horizon brand to begin with, but surprise, surprise, nobody really cares about Horizon. PlayStation desperately wants a family-friendly franchise for everybody to look at. They just haven't been able to deliver that, and they keep trying it with Horizon. They've done VR games, they did a Lego collaboration here, but nobody cared for it. And as this headline says, it debuted to even less Steam players than Concord. There just is not an appeal for Horizon across the board that I think PlayStation really wants. They also released an Until Dawn remake, which ended up being a lot worse than its original game. It debuted at 28% weaker than Sony's, again, their disaster of Concord. So just a number of releases. They've had some success last year. Helldivers 2 and Astrobot are at the top of that list, but they also have just had some massive, massive stinkers, which really have soured this console generation and really called into question the management that is happening at PlayStation. But there was also this. We've heard from some of the people that made the last console generation, the PlayStation 4 console generation, calling out and really disagreeing with what we've seen from the management of Jim Ryan and Herman Hulst. Former PlayStation boss Shuhei Yoshida says he would have resisted live service push. And in this interview that he gives, he says, "For me, I was managing this budget, so I was responsible for allocating money to what kind of games to make." And he said this to Kind of Funny Games. If the company was considering going that way, it probably didn't make sense to stop making another God of War single-player game and put all the money into the live service games. However, what they did when I left and Herman took over is the company gave us a lot more resources. I don't think they told Herman to stop making single-player games. They said, "These games are great, keep doing that, and we'll give you additional resources to work on these live service games and try it." But ultimately, you're pulling resources, you're pulling developers off single-player entries to do stuff like this, especially when you have these single-player studios with a lot of, let's just say, less expertise in multiplayer games, which can be very complex and complicated. And that's why we've seen massive departures at these studios, and yes, that will impact future work, and they will be lesser in some regards. There is an impact. This is why, like, you look at studios like Crystal Dynamics, Rocksteady Games, BioWare. They went to that live service route. They were not experienced for it, and they paid for it dearly in terms of they just haven't recovered in many regards, especially with their writing teams and the creatives that really just want to work on single-player entries. But Yoshida did continue. He said, "I'm sure they knew it was risky. The chance of a game becoming successful in this hugely competitive genre would be small. However, the company, knowing that risk, gave Herman the resources and chance to try it, and they did. I think that's the way they did it. In my mind, that's great, and hopefully some games will become successful." Most of them haven't. Most of them haven't even seen the light of day. But Yoshida does continue. He said, "Luckily, Helldivers 2 did so well. Nobody expected that. So you can't plan a success in this industry. Although Helldivers 2, again, there was already expertise with that. And Arrowhead's not owned by PlayStation, so there was less of a risk, I guess you could say. That's the most fun part of this business. I hope that this strategy will work in the end. If I was in the Herman's position, probably I would have tried to resist that direction. Maybe that's one of the reasons they removed me from first party, said Yoshida, who was president of Sony Worldwide Studios for 11 years, covering one of the most memorable and successful periods, like I brought up earlier on, and then creating The Last of Us, Horizon, Ghost of Tsushima, among many other hits. In 2019, he stepped down from to take a role at SIE's Independent Developer Initiative to nurture external, smaller independent studios. Explaining the decision, Yoshida said that although he was sad to step away from first-party development, he believed the decision was the right thing for the company so that a new leader could bring renewed energy and ideas, and those renewed ideas was just what every AAA publisher was envisioning, which was recurrent consumer spending and not understanding that there isn't this massive want for these live service entries. We want to see a continuation of these single-player franchises, and I guess many AAA publishers, it took disaster after disaster to realize that. But we also did hear from Sean Layden, one of the former top executives last console generation. He also talked about the recent push into recurrent consumer spending and live service at PlayStation. He said this about 10 months ago in a podcast with What's Up PlayStation.
Because you'll hear the term recurring revenue come up again and again. And that's a huge driver here. I'm not taking away, people say, well, this creative team has a creative idea and this has this world that goes on forever. That's fine. I understand that. And that can be driven by a creative piece. But a lot of this sector is driven by this desire for, quote, recurring revenue. What I mean by that is, maybe it's a subscription, or maybe it's, we continue to do microtransactions and you can buy new t-shirts and new kicks and, here's a gun that's bigger than his gun or whatever. That recurring revenue where the money keeps coming in. One of the things that really upsets or concerns the finance sector in the gaming business is the volatility of the revenue curve. Game ships, bunch of money. Game not shipping, game building. We're just spending. We're not making any money. And then we have a peak and we have a valley, a peak and a valley. That's the nature of the beast in entertainment. But of course, you're running a business, you try to limit that volatility, right? Volatility gives you headaches and makes you lose your hair. So you want to limit that, and you say, well, with a subscription formula or with a microtransaction formula against a game over a long period of time, there will be a constant drip of money into that business model. And so we have recurring revenue. It flattens the pain of the up and down. And wouldn't that be great? In theory, yes, indeed. But in practice, there's a very small handful of games who can do it. And not only there's a handful of games that can do it, there's only so many of those games the market can tolerate.
And what he's just hitting on is the fact that a lot of AAA publishers, and this goes for Sony as well, they've looked at Fortnite, they looked at GTA Online, and they said, why don't we have that? Why don't we have that revenue coming in regularly for months on end? And that's why they've felt that they can take that risk, or they want to take that risk. And that's why we keep on seeing these live service disasters. And unfortunately for us, we just have to deal with it, the headache of it. And these publishers, unfortunately, just aren't learning the lesson because they realize they want to keep on taking those risks. And PlayStation isn't going to stop with this. We're going to continue to see live services, although it does appear that there might be a big shift happening. And that is where we lead to this. It was the fact that Herman Hulst is no longer PlayStation's co-CEO, but he is still in charge of first party. Hideki Nishino is now taking sole control. This was announced just a couple of days ago. In this article coming from Push Square, ex-Guerrilla Games managing director Herman Hulst was appointed co-CEO alongside Platform Business Group bigwig Hideki Nishino following the departure of Jim Ryan. The pair's tenure officially started on the 1st of June last year, but the run is over as Nishino will now take sole CEO control of Sony Interactive Entertainment, the Sony business subsidiary which contains PlayStation. And Nishino saying in a press release, he said, "I am truly honored to take the helm at Sony. Technology and creativity of our biggest strengths as we continue to focus on developing experiences that deliver entertainment for everyone. We will continue to grow the PlayStation community in new ways, such as intellectual property expansion, while also delivering the best in technology innovation." And Nishino comes from the platform line, so there does seem to be indication that he's going to be more focused on the PlayStation hardware. We might be seeing maybe less PC releases as well. But it does mention here that Holst will continue to lead PlayStation's first party, so this reorganization doesn't change an enormous amount for the day-to-day running of this organization, but Hermen Hulst now answers to somebody. That is the big change here, and it does appear that PlayStation, at least the executives, want to go in the direction of Nishino rather than Holst, and I think there's a good reason why. We've seen what Holst wanted for this console generation, and it has not paid off. We also see that a lot of it is what Jim Ryan envisioned, and Jim Ryan ultimately ran out before the damage really hit, and this was him retiring. I think this was in September of 2023. He retired after 28 years with Sony, but the damage has been done, and we're seeing that with a game like Concord just a couple of months ago, and some of the games that are on the way, and some of the cancellations that were just announced the other day. We'll get into that. We did see, again, this was Jim Ryan for many years. He says he thinks live service games will overtake subscription services. This was in 2022. He also, again, said this in 2022, Sony sees bright future for live service games, but it's all about choice, executive says. We also saw Jim Ryan, a report coming about in 2023, right around the time that he was leaving, that PlayStation Studios reportedly struggled with live service pivot under Jim Ryan. This report coming from Bloomberg pretty much just says what was obvious to us all. According to Schreier, PlayStation Studios has spent nearly a decade building teams with expert experience in single-player cinematic blockbusters. As a result, pushing live services has produced mixed results. 3 major Sony studios, Guerrilla Games, Naughty Dog, and Insomniac, are working on live service games, some of which have reportedly been canceled or overhauled. Sony made the high-profile acquisition of Bungie and made no secret of its desire to use the studio's expertise in the live service arena. However, insiders are skeptical of the move and have expressed concerns about the lack of a coherent vision within PlayStation, further complicated by what some view as misplaced bets on niche products like PSVR and a newly unveiled PlayStation Portal. And ultimately with Bungie, their issues have only continued, and they've gotten much, much worse, especially with what happened last year. But Hermen Hulst has been doing the same thing. He said Sony will continue to make live service titles, this was earlier in the year, as they're learning from Helldivers 2. But now he is no longer the head honcho of PlayStation. There is somebody over him, Nishino, and we are starting to see a massive pivot happening. We saw this with cancellation earlier this month, or last month now in January. Sony canceled 2 more live service games, reportedly including a God of War title. Yes, they were working on a God of War live service. Makes no fucking sense, but yeah, so anyway, this report goes on to say Sony canceled live service games in development at Bend Studio and Bluepoint Games. Yes, Bluepoint, after working on the fantastic Demon's Souls remake, they went on to work 2 years on God of War Ragnarok, I'm guessing, to get expertise in the franchise, and then 2 years working on a live service, a fucking live service God of War game. Don't even know how that would have worked. It doesn't make any sense, and now it's dead. Sony's spokesperson confirmed that both games had been canceled following a recent review. We don't know entirely what Bend Studios was working on, but again, Days Gone I thought was a really enjoyable experience last console generation. Would have loved to see Days Gone 2, but instead they were working on live service slop, and it doesn't appear we're going to see a Days Gone 2 ever, and I just find that so disappointing. Bend and Bluepoint are highly accomplished teams who are valued members of the PlayStation Studios family, and we are working closely with each studio to determine what are the next projects, Sony told Bloomberg, and I can only hope that they're not more live service nonsense. But to continue this, just a couple of days later, we got this announcement that NC Soft, who is working on a Horizon MMORPG, has seemingly been canceled. And yes, if you didn't know, they were making 2 Horizon live services, one from Guerrilla Games, one from NC Soft, and I guess somebody at Sony realized finally, the Horizon franchise isn't as popular as I think we hoped it to be, and they realized making 2 of them probably a big mistake, and they finally canceled it. But how far into development, that's unclear. But I think it is important to understand we still have many live services on the way from PlayStation, many of which probably are unannounced and we don't know about yet, but we do know Fairgames is on the way. You know that debut trailer, which looked disastrous. The whole premise of the game is eat the rich, very cringe, and many questions about it. We have not seen anything since its debut trailer back in 2023, and I think after Concord, many were calling for this to be canceled, but I can only expect that we're probably going to see some new gameplay this year and probably a release date, and I would hope that they probably changed that name to begin with. But yeah, competitive heist experience, another live service. I just feel like this has disaster written all over it, but we'll see what happens. It's Haven Studios, a new one under PlayStation. There is also, again, Horizon Online is still on the way. This is what Guerrilla Games is concentrating on. It's not Horizon 3, it's not a new Killzone, not a new IP, it's just Horizon Online. And again, this is another one that I feel very skeptical about, but we'll see what happens with it. But PlayStation, the chaos that is happening has only continued. They released Spider-Man 2 on Steam, and it just did not have the prowess that its original game had. There has been reports that there has been many technical issues that players have been hit with. It's one of those rare misses, but it is a question of, are we going to see PlayStation maybe pivoting under Nishino? Is it going to be less PC releases and just concentrating just on PlayStation 5 games? That'll be very interesting to see if there are some massive changes in that regard. But there is also the fact that Bloodborne, a 60 FPS mod that was released like 3 years ago, it was targeted recently by Sony for a DMCA takedown. Some people believe that because we're getting close to the 10-year anniversary, maybe this is going to be a big announcement about a Bloodborne remake or something coming to PC, PS5. We'll see what happens in that regard. I'm skeptical of it. It is, though, very weird that PlayStation would finally target this 3 years later. Other AAA publishers usually have done stuff like this, going after mods and all of that, especially when they have remasters and remakes on the way. So maybe this is an indication of that. Maybe this will end up being a positive, or maybe this is just a really dumb decision that Sony did. Who knows? But right now, a lot of people are hopeful that this means that something is on the way. There was also the fact that Sony has eased up on their PSN requirement. I don't know how or why they didn't do this from the get-go, but yes, they have made it an optional thing for Spider-Man 2, The Last of Us Part 2, and a number of other single-player games. It just feels like shooting yourself in the foot to make this a requirement for single-player games. Again, 177 countries, territories did not have access to even playing or buying the game. That feels like Sony just throwing money into a fire pit and letting it burn. But now they've realized that maybe that's not a smart decision. And then even just a couple of days ago, there's another massive rumor which emerged that Demon's Souls is not said to be coming to PC, and Gran Turismo 7 no longer coming to PC, which some people believe, if this insider is right, that there may be a massive pivot happening at PlayStation, maybe under Nishino, that we're going to see less releases coming to PC, and then really honing in on the platform, which would make sense with his experience and what he's been known for in the past, before becoming now the sole CEO of PlayStation. But yeah, the PlayStation 6 is only a couple of years away. I think people really need to understand that we are nearing the end of the PlayStation 5 console generation, and I look at everything that we talked about throughout this video as examples of constant chaos and really a lot of disappointment with the investments and the strategies that they chose to aim for this console generation. Like some of the single player games that have come about, they disappointed just with their narrative quality. Like God of War Ragnarok didn't hit the same way that I had hoped for. I think they really rushed to end the Norse chapter. Make of that as you will. Horizon, it's just never clicked for me the same that it has for others, and I do think that PlayStation's really gone all out with trying to make it this big bad franchise, and I just don't think it has clicked with the audience in the way that I think that they had hoped for. But yeah, the PlayStation 6 is likely less than 2 years away, or right around 2 years away, and we're going to start to hear a lot more about this console generation. But does PlayStation have time to turn things around with them now pivoting a little bit less, away from live services and honing in back on what they are known for, single player entries? I don't know. I am skeptical of that. I think the damage has been done this console generation, and I think the results of the changes, or we're going to start to see it with the PlayStation 6. But this year alone, we do have Ghost of Yotei. That is coming. We'll see what ends up being. This is the spiritual successor, I guess, to Ghost of Tsushima from Sucker Punch Productions. There has been some skepticism with this game, but I think it has looked pretty good. We'll see new protagonists, new direction that they are taking with this. Phantom Blade Zero might be the next big Chinese mega hit. While it isn't technically an exclusive, it is just coming to PlayStation, and trailers, gameplay has looked absolutely fantastic. It really is just a question of when this does release, and all indication is that sometime probably in the later half of 2026. Marvel's Wolverine from Insomniac Games is eventually going to release. Obviously, if you haven't heard, Insomniac Games was hacked. The entire game was pretty much leaked online. It's unclear if they're making any massive overhauls or if the direction has changed at all, but we should be hearing about this sometime in the near future, especially because it was teased years ago. There's Intergalactic, the Heretic Prophet. Again, this one has been mired in controversy already, many taking issue with the protagonist decision that Naughty Dog is going with, and that is just the nature of the culture war stuff that's going online right now. But hey, it is Naughty Dog, and I'm sure it is going to sell, but how much? That's a question. There's also the fact that a new God of War game is said to be in development, and it is said to be set in Egyptian mythology. Not too surprising based on some of the things that Cory Barlog said years ago about what he wanted to do past the Norse chapter. But is this stuff going to be releasing towards the end of the PlayStation 5 console generation, or is this going to be stuff that starts off the PlayStation 6 console generation? I guess it's just the question of, can this console generation, can the feelings about it change? And I'm extremely skeptical on that. Anyway, PlayStation has undergone some massive changes just this last month, and they've canceled a number of live service games just in the last year or two. But still, there are said to be like 6 or so in development, some of which that we don't know about. But what do you make of the PlayStation 5 console generation right now? Do you think that is it a success in your eyes or not? Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. But thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like if you did enjoy this video, or if you found any informative value. Consider subscribing for more videos like this, and I'll see you later.